Well, thank you very much. A couple of housekeeping comments before we begin. This is being videotaped, so if you have your cell phones or any electronic devices, they have to be turned off so they don't interfere with that stuff. The other thing is, remember we're being videotaped, so if it's going to go up on the NACM website. If you don't want your boss to hear your comments, remember that it's going to be out there. NACM. Again, I'm Bob Coyne. I'm really very happy to be here. Unlike a lot of people who are making comments about being in Minnesota in February, when I found that out, I actually got excited by that. I happen to love the state of Minnesota, even though I was born and raised in Ohio. But part of my career, I was actually the vice president of corporate operations for Prudential and worked in a building down on 5th Street. And had to come here for about a week a month for about 10 years out of my life. So for me, this was in some ways a kind of homecoming for me. And when I got here on Sunday morning, I got up and I ran down to that old building. I just wanted to get down and see what had been kind of the place where I worked for a while. And it brought back great memories, not only of a city that I think is incredible, quite honestly, but of really kind people. That was the one impression that I always have around Minneapolis and Minnesota, was that just the fundamental kindness of the people that I ran into here. So welcome into this session. What we're going to be doing here a little bit is talking about the whole idea around fire drills, setting priorities, what it is we need to start focusing on in our courts. This is not going to be real news to you guys. But no matter what we've been doing over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years in terms of how we've been administering our courts and dealing with the challenges that we've had over those years, the landscape has absolutely changed. How many of you would agree that we're at a point right now in terms of funding, in terms of the view of the court, and in terms of where we think we're heading into the future, where it's profoundly different from what it was 10 years ago? Yeah, every one of you, right? And it's good, because that's the reality. It really is different. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about the idea of where courts are heading, where I think court leadership is heading in particular, and some of the things that we need to do within our institutions and our organizations to understand better our priorities, articulate a little bit better what it is we're doing. And then at the end of this thing, I want to talk a little bit about how we perform our work. The idea of the fire drill is very real. And from my own experience, I had to do a lot of different things to get my own agenda within my work, the framework of my work, going in the right direction so I could really focus on the right things. So we're going to talk a little bit about the core challenges, transforming crisis into opportunities. We're going to look at the priorities challenge, strategies to look at how we define our priorities, and then finally turning down the noise. How do we stop the fire drill part of that? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the idea of transformation. That's actually one of the themes of your entire conference, right? You want to be transformational in terms of governance, in terms of the way we do that. And that's a wonderful term because it really gets at the idea that when you're transforming something, you're doing fundamental change. You're taking it in an entirely different direction. But just to set the context about what it is we have to be confronting, we look at a little bit from the ABA Task Force on Preservation of the Justice System, and I'm sure you all know that the ABA itself has a number of task forces that relate to court practice, or whatever. But the ABA has been in the forefront of really saying that we have a challenge right now in front of our courts that in some ways is unprecedented, and it's threatening the very foundation of what our courts are all about. So they give those examples within their own report. Around 26 states have they're delaying filling judicial positions. They know that we're not filling staff positions. 31 states have either frozen or reduced the salaries of judges or staff. 16 have furloughed clerical staff with commensurate reduction in pay, on and on and on and on. And every state and local court I could have 20 pages of these bullets, right, where every state and local court starts explaining some negative impact that's occurred that's threatening the court system. Now, none of this is news to you, right? You guys live this kind of stuff every day. But very often when we think about, when we're operating our courts, we're thinking about our staffs, we're thinking about the divisions that are operating, how we open the courts. I really want people to connect to, particularly at the leadership level, is to really start buying into the idea that what you do in the courts is so critically important to the community that we can't let the court system fail, okay? I've done work with a couple of different courts. One of them actually was told by their legislature not even to submit a budget. The idea of it was, we're not totally sure that we can fund what you're doing. Now that's that one example of how threatening this is becoming in terms of what we're going to do. Because from my point of view of this, you look at who really pays the price when our courts can't function at the levels they ought to function at. And I would say that no matter what you're dealing with right now, the effect that we're dealing with in our courts is actually cumulative. It's not what the legislature did last year or what they might do next year. It's what I call death by 1,000 cuts, right? There's a little bit, there's a slash here, a slash here, a slash here. Every year for at least the last 5 or 10 years, we've been taking cuts in our budgets and having the expectation that we do more with less. The reality of it is we've got to make sure the community understands that we're going to start having to do less with less, right? We can't keep expanding the services of the court within the limitations that we have in terms of funding and access to other resources. So we might pay that price a little bit when we're working there, but it's really the community who's paying the price of our courts not being able to operate at full tilt. Think about that. Justice delayed really is justice denied. There are a lot of situations, if you really think at the human level, the human impact level of what's happening in our courts, you have situations where family courts aren't able to operate correctly, adoptions haven't been going through, there are very serious issues around not just adoption, but custody and all those kinds of things. Those issues aren't getting resolved as quickly as they needed to get resolved. On the business side, there are businesses that are going out of business, not because they're bad business folks, but because there's some dispute that they have to get in front of the court and they can't get it resolved in time. And so as a result, they lose their business before they can actually get in front of the courts. You look at the public safety impact. You look at the impact on the business community. Every time we end up having one more level of cut or a service cut within the courts, there's a direct effect somewhere in the community. And I think that the idea of it is, when you think about what it is the courts do, our founding fathers set up 3 different separate branches of government. Each of them were supposed to be independent, right? The judiciary is one of them. Why do you think the judiciary is separate? Why is it its own branch of government? Why isn't it just part of the executive branch or part of the legislative branch? Any ideas? The check and balance, right. Because what do the courts really do? I've said very, very often when I get in front of courts that it's so important to me that we understand what it is that the courts do in society. And I'm talking about bottom line social good. You can't have a free democracy if you don't have a free judiciary, right? The courts are the arbiter of fairness, community fairness. That's what we do in a democracy. That's what the courts do. We don't have, as citizens, any place to turn. There's no structural, institutional place for us to turn for justice and for fairness except the courts. That's what you do. That's why we have a free society. We sure don't want people going out and solving disputes on their own, right? We want to always make sure that we're beyond people settling their scores one-on-one, because that's never going to be fair. But we have the judiciary out there. And when I was working in a court system, I used to want people to walk in every day and understand, I don't care what level you were working at in the court, I didn't care what job you had in the court, I wanted you to understand that when you walked in the door every day, what you were doing was you were the bulwark of freedom. That's what this country is all about. And the judiciary is vitally important to that. You'll see every day what happens when we can't get everything through the system quickly enough, right? You see it. You know, what harm is there when people can't turn to the court in time? Do you see harm? Do you think there's a harm? Why?
People stay in jail, or they get out on bond and go out and kill somebody.
Right.
Families don't get divorced, so violence escalates. People can't settle their lawsuits, and it's expensive that way.
See, but that's exactly right. That's why it's so critically important that when we start thinking about the future of our courts, that we become very, very clear about being able to articulate our mission. I think Pam made the comment this morning that part of the question that's always in front of the court is, are we relevant? Well, we know that we are. But how do we always make the case outside of the court system itself, or when we're not talking to ourselves, we're not talking to lawyers or judges or whatever, how do we make sure that people understand exactly what that relevance is? Okay? So when we think about it, this is really a very, very big crisis for all of us, and it's a crisis for the community. But how do we make that a good thing, right? I told the group earlier this morning, I come from a family with 8 kids, and my reputation among all of those 8 was, in fact, they'll still say that I was the kid all of my life who just looked at life through rose-colored glasses. They thought that no matter what happened, there was a way to kind of make something good out of it. I actually believe that's true. And I think the whole idea of transformation, when we're talking about that, how do we take what's a real crisis and then really reframe that in a way so that it becomes an opportunity for us? I think that's one of the most exciting things we can do as managers, as leaders, as core people, or whatever it is to get turned on by the idea of the possibilities. If nothing else, what this crisis has done is opened the door and the opportunity for us to reframe and think almost everything through, because everything is on the table in a way that it never was before, right? We can have a lot of discussions within our courts around the transformation of services. We can have discussions around things that maybe we need to stop doing. We can have discussions around how we do our staffing now and the whole bit, because we have to have those discussions. It's the opportunity to look at everything from a completely different point of view. And I would suggest to you that you guys are just so critically, vitally important to what that transformation has to be. You are the leaders of what your courts are. You are the decision makers. You are the people who are in charge of making sure that resources are there, and that what we act and how we react is actually in the best way that it can be all the time. So I think the idea of it is, I always want people who are in management roles to think of themselves as having one fundamental job. We're thought leaders. Our job is to think. That obviously gets to the question, how many of you think of your job as thinking? Okay, 5, 6, anybody else? How much of your workday do you devote to just thinking? I'm sorry? Right. We don't. Now, when I point out that we don't, it doesn't mean that we're thoughtless. It doesn't mean we don't have brains, okay? But part of the gift that we bring to our organizations, by virtue of our leadership, by virtue of the fact that we have the training, the experience, the time and place to understand the way courts operate, the gift we bring is our minds. I think almost by nature, people who are in public service, and particularly in the courts, there are 2 traits that I've seen in almost every administrator. One of them is a sense of altruism, right? That's part of us. We ought to love that. We like being helpful people. The other part is almost to a fault, we're problem solvers. We love to jump in and solve problems. It's almost second nature to us, right? So we're going to talk a little bit later on about what that means when we get into the situation where we see ourselves as fundamentally problem solvers, and then that means we jump into a lot of things that we get involved in. But I want you to think about the idea that the real gift we bring from our experience and from our knowledge is taking the downtime to think through problems, to recognize what they are, conceive of solutions, and move forward on that. We think. So here's the fun part. We get to leave behind us all the limitations of the status quo right now, okay? When we say we want to transform our courts, part of that is because culture is transforming them on our behalf. Economics are transforming them on our behalf. There are a lot of influences that are out there in the real world around transformation that we are not controlling, and our job is to get control of them, okay? That's fun. It's like I said before, we're free to discuss or consider or evaluate anything that we want to think about now in ways that we never could have done that before. The crisis opens the door to reframe our thinking almost entirely. And through that, you can reframe your management practice. How many of you would explain what you do to people by saying that you have a management practice? Okay? I can say I have a consulting practice, and people understand what that is. When I was working in government, I actually had a professional management practice, and when I stepped out of government and started getting into consulting and doing everything, I always explained that when I was in government, I was fundamentally fulfilling a management practice. We can do that, and we need to think about ourselves that way. So the idea is crisis can transform what really was impossible before into the possible. There are courts all over this country that are having debates on how they staff, how they fund, what programs they're operating, which ones they're not operating, which ones they have to stop doing, which ones they might have to enhance. And it's all because the crisis has produced the opportunity to do that. And you guys are in the best position to lead all of that transformation. Okay? You know exactly where you need to be, but getting there won't be achieved by accident. We're going to talk about the idea that this has to be a highly disciplined process to identify and choose the priorities of every one of our individual courts. And I mean disciplined. So our focus for today is really going to be articulate the critical role of court managers to define, adopt, and act on the priorities of your court. And every one of your courts is different. You know, there's no way anybody can stand up here and tell a court how to operate because every court has so many different unique characteristics. How they operate, the political environment that they're involved in, the nature of the support of the community, all of that stuff. So it ends up having it to be an individual discussion within your own court on how we do that. Discuss some of the barriers that get at us where we're not able to really focus on the things we need to do as managers. They're very real, but they also can be controlled. And then suggest approaches that would limit and reduce some of those distractions so that we make sure that we're always paying attention to our most important objectives. So let's talk about the leadership part of it. Leadership is near and dear to my heart. I absolutely love the topic. I have been pretty much doing training and talking about leadership for somewhere around 25 years. And all of it comes down to the fact that leadership is so vitally important to organizational life that when we fail in leadership, we fail to perform and deliver on the mission of whatever it is we happen to be doing. So I want to look at really two areas. One of them is leadership, and leadership goes way beyond what's going to be up here on these bullet points, but a couple of things that I want you to think about in terms of your own courts and how we run or operate our courts. First of all, we know that we're responsible for planning. We do planning, execution, staffing, organizing. There's all that stuff that we do that's kind of within the management bailiwick of what we do as leaders. The other part is that we really are the figurehead of an organization. We're the symbolic head of a team, and people see us as the symbolic head of that team, right? So we have a role just right there in terms of the symbol of us representing the institution to a lot of different places that are out there. You know, it's like the Queen of England. She doesn't really have a job, but she really does. She is a very important figurehead in terms of what it is she represents. When we're in management roles, we're the exact same thing. And there are two things about that. Once you get out of a staff role into a management or a leadership role, your first duty and your first obligation is to the institution. It's to the good of the court. And I mean that broadly. Doesn't mean within your division or whatever. It's to the good of the court. We step up. We say, I'm now going to be in a leadership role or a management role in this thing, and my loyalty is to the institution. That always comes number one. Your divisions and your people actually come after that. There's got to be a singular focus on what it is we do. And I would hope that that echoes back a little bit to my comments earlier, because what the courts do is so important in terms of our freedom and our democracy and our communities. It's important. We're also a liaison, right? We're the communication link among a large number of internal and external stakeholders, and we represent the organization. So again, there's that organizational, enterprise-wide look that we have to understand as part of our role when we're in leadership. The other big portion of this is we're decision makers, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of Henry Mintzberg, but he's a management theorist, and he wrote a book, The Nature of Managerial Work, and I like a lot of his thinking. But one of the things he describes leadership, and particularly in the public sector, as entrepreneurs, right? Why do you think he says we're entrepreneurs? What's entrepreneurial about what we do? Or let's go back one. Too often when we're working in the public sector, we don't even use the term entrepreneur, right? We see that almost exclusively as a private sector type of work, a private sector kind of thinking, right? It's always for profit, it's always cutting edge or whatever. Why are you entrepreneurs? What's entrepreneurial about what we ought to be doing in the courts? Any guesses?
Trying to stay current on top of technology, take advantage of what's out there.
Yeah, that's part of it. What else? Can you say it louder? So, she said, we're paving the way for the future.
We safeguard the assets of the court.
Yeah, you do safeguard the assets of the court, and that's part of it. And there's one other aspect of it. Entrepreneurship is really a kind of creativity, right? We're creative. You've got to think outside of the box. That's what entrepreneurs do. You create something new. You push the edge. You push the envelope. You people do that every day in your job. You just maybe don't recognize it, right? But there's an entrepreneurial spirit that's in public service that's every bit as strong and as healthy as it would ever be in the private sector. And in some ways, I would say it's even stronger. I've spent 30 years. I spent 17 of them in government. Then I spent 10 years in the for-profit sector. Then I spent another 10 or however many that was in the nonprofit sector before I started my consulting. And oh, by the way, my family thinks that as a consultant, I'm actually doing a nonprofit business. Not the way it's supposed to work, but that's the way it is. But I'll tell you, after watching public administrators for a long time, the entrepreneurial spirit in government is stronger than it is in the private sector. It really is. We have to be creative in what it is we do. We're trained to be creative in what it is we do because we always have to come up with some new solution when some barrier comes into what it is we do. We're good at it. And I think public sector planners are better than almost anybody that I've met anywhere. So we're entrepreneurs in that sense. We're also negotiators, right? We represent the interests of the court in a wide variety of settings and situations, and we always want to negotiate for the best advantage of the court on our behalf. But I'm sure you all have gone out. You've either dealt with executive branch agencies or the legislature or the public or the press or whatever. But we're negotiating all the time and positioning the court some way in terms of what it is we need to have done. Then again, we're a liaison. We're a communication link out there. And then finally, we're resource managers. We're the ones who decide the optimal allocation of the resources within all the restraints of the court, all the constraints that are on the court right at the moment. So we have all of these different kinds of roles and hats that we're wearing all the time. So we know some of the things that we do. We know historically what it is we've done. We even know right now what a lot of the barriers are in terms of what we have to do on behalf of the court. But then kind of internally to the court and how we do our work, there are a lot of institutional and personal barriers that can distract us from focusing on our priorities. Now, here's kind of a typical priorities challenge. How do we choose from among all of these different things that come from us? And again, much like that list in the beginning, you all have dealt with all of this at some level, right? Some of you probably walk in the door and deal with at least 6 of those bullets on the same day. It's all there. It's all there in terms of what we understand we're really going to be dealing with in terms of our court. It all goes on and on and on. But how do we choose? What do we pay attention to? Or what should we pay attention to? Do we even need priorities? Or we just simply walk in the door and allow ourselves to react because so many things come at us at the same time? Got to think about how we do that and why that's important. So when you think about your own workday, what drives your to-do list? When you walk in, what do you pay attention to? Deadlines? That's exactly the first answer they gave in the group this morning, deadlines.
Whatever comes to the door.
Whatever comes to the door. How else?
Whatever came out of my last meeting with my presiding judge.
There's a man who understands priorities, right? What else? Email. Any other things that determine your priorities?
Whatever goals that I'm working on.
Can you say that again and louder, please?
Whatever goals that I'm working on.
Whatever goals. Why is that your priority?
Because it's something you have to do, so you have to keep it in front of you all the time.
Exactly. These are all good answers because the reality of it is these are all real answers, right? When you walk in the day. Obviously, kind of where we're heading with this, I like the idea that your priority are your goals. We have to understand that that really is one of the biggest priorities we need to be paying attention to. But we have to always balance it with the real reality of work, which is when we walk in the door, there's going to be something that pushes a button that gets you going down some path, right? It's going to be there. But what's getting your attention? That's it. The urgent, right? I talk to people about one of the biggest problems we have in leadership and in managing an organization is, and you're going to recognize this, the urgent is always always displacing what's important, right? It is the fire drill of the day. You walk in, things that have urgency to them now have my time and my attention. But if we understand that what's happening in the court system is that everything really is transformational, and that the world that's going to be out there in 6 months and 8 months or 3 years or 5 years is not the world we're dealing with today, we have to regroup, and we can't let that happen. Because the comment, well, hello, Pam. I made the comment that you said earlier, are the courts relevant? Part of the issue is nobody is going to go out there, do the thinking time that I told you we have to do, and articulate the value of the court, right? We have to start positioning ourselves much more strategically to make sure that people understand we're relevant. So that when people ask about what's going on in the court, we know exactly what the priorities are that we have to pay attention to. When we talk to legislators, we know exactly what we have to have funding for, and we don't have to have funding for everything that we have funding for, right? Because it's not going to be there. So we have to start knowing how to carve out things that are actually critical core services of the court, and start recognizing that there are some things we may in the long run have to stop doing. And the best people to articulate that are sitting right here in this room. But we can't get there if the urgent keeps doing that. So if we think beyond the daily fire drill that we all know we have, okay, and we walk into, do you have sufficient time to think about, define, and execute on your strategic priorities and your tactical priorities for your court? How many of you think you have enough time to do that? Okay, no one. So I'm going to boomerang back a little bit. The days of being able to lead organizations and survive without knowing and setting the time off on our calendars to do this have to be over, okay? Probably the biggest threat that we actually have to the courts is not so much that we're going to have budget cuts, but because we're not positioning ourselves as powerfully and as strongly as we can. I was working with a court up in Canada, and their court administrator made just a brilliant comment. He said, whenever I walk in front of the legislature, we're the one branch that doesn't sit down. We can't sit there and say to them, this is what we do, this is how we do it, this is why it's important. And he said, I lose funding every time I do it because I'm competing against DHHS, Health and Human Services, Public Safety, who are trained in this and they think in this way and they know how to do that competitively on behalf of their organizations. So part of what we were talking about was, okay, how do we get that ball back in our court? How do we do this? Strategic planning, tactical planning, execution, these are the fundamental deliverables of what managers do. These are our number one and number two. But it's most often the two that end up getting backburnered because of the urgency. Now I want you to understand something. I'm not being critical of anybody in their job. What I'm telling you, this has been my experience of 30 years of work life. And so I want to give you the benefit of the idea of the thinking behind this and why I had to transform my work. Because every time I was responding to a crisis, I was actually doing a good job. Every time I let somebody walk in my door and take me off my path, I was doing a good job. Just like all of you, right? There wasn't anything bad about my work. Nobody thought I was a bad manager. I was just a manager. It was just typical of what a day was. But I realized that I had to start getting my time back again. I had to get my life back in order to really preserve the interests of the organizations that I was working for, because the threats out there were real. And so it's more of a collaborative thing. Don't go down the path that I went down for a long time. And I had to retrain myself almost completely in terms of my own work priorities and how we go about doing that. Okay? And it came back to the fact that I had to say to myself, what is this organization really relying on me for? What's the my job part of, oh yes, and oh by the way, I also do really have a job? You know, when you're doing the 35 other things. How many times do people say, but why don't people understand I really have a job too? And so at the end of the day, you're saying to yourself, I didn't get my work done, right? So what do you think the barriers are that block us from acting on those things? Why is it so easy to get off track and then so hard to get back on the train? What are they? What happens? Why is it easy to get off track from what we plan to do? Because I'm willing to bet every one of you walks in the door with a plan for your day, right? Or it might even be something you know you have to do in a month or a week or whatever, but you have a plan. But we get knocked off. Why do we get knocked off so easily?
Interruptions.
Okay, like what?
Somebody comes through the door that you didn't anticipate with an issue
Right.
that they would like resolved there, whether it's a decision or whatever.
Right. But they've taken you out of your groove, right? No matter what you were doing, you're now not doing that anymore. What else besides interruptions?
Happens a lot of technology breakdown in one of the courtrooms or somewhere.
Right.
Has to be addressed right away.
She was talking about technology breakdowns. Sometimes I'll repeat for purposes of the video, if you don't mind. But yeah, the technology goes down in courtrooms right now. You shut down a courtroom sometimes, right? I mean, that's it. You got to go out and get that done. What else?
I think sometimes when you get taken off track, you also take on the responsibility that whatever came to you, you have to fix it.
Oh, please. Could you say it again really loud? I love that comment.
What did I say?
Do you want me to tell you?
I wonder if we're recording it.
No,
No, it's just
no, so you take on the assumption to fix it.
you take on the assumption to fix it. If your structure is in place, you would have places that goes and keeps you on track.
Right. No, that's a really good comment because that's one of the things that in some ways is our strength. We can do that. It's also our Achilles heel because we can do that, right? We can go out and help. But that can eat up tons of time in terms of what we're supposed to be doing as we go out and respond to other things. And it's that thing that I said before about our natural instinct to want to be helpful, because we are. We're fix-it people, right? We get a lot of pleasure out of fixing things when there's a crisis and there's something to do. I love it. I get a lot of pleasure out of being able to be the problem solver that people come to. The problem is, at the end of the day, I end up creating tremendous problems for me, and I didn't have the same advantage as everybody else. When you don't get your job done, most of you probably don't have somebody you can hand those roles off to, right? It's still just yours, whether we're doing it in the course of one work day or 5 weekends or 22 days or anything like that. Our job is still there. So when we want to talk about defining our priorities, there are a couple of things, and these can't be specific because every court really is very, very different. But we have to understand a couple of things that, in my view, are mission critical. One of them, we really have to say that within our court, we have to know what the most important critical drivers are for our court. And so we can do that in a bit of a hierarchy. We can sit there, we can say, the first thing is a risk assessment. What are the areas of highest risk to your mission and what it is you do as a court? And if you solve that, if you spend time figuring out what that is, you've already started the process of risk mitigation for your court. But it's the areas of highest risk. Most of the courts that I work in, the area of highest risk right now actually does happen to be funding. A real lack of certainty in terms of the next few years and in terms of what their funding stream is going to be. That should mean for us that we start really getting a handle on what it is that we have to be doing in the court. What are those core services that we can't give up because the community is so dependent on them? Okay, so it's risk. The next one is the idea of strategic positioning. This is where we have to be able to talk about the value proposition of the court to people who don't work in the court. Legislators, the community, executive branch, where we're out there, you know, in some ways we shouldn't actually be in a position of fighting for everything that we have to do in the courts, but we are, okay? It's a real competition. And the people who position themselves most strongly by being able to say, we must have this, we must have this, we must have this, because it's integral to the functioning of the court and it's integral to the functioning of society. We have to have these. What we never want to do, is leave the decision on what's important in terms of our strategic priorities to somebody else, right? We want to be in control of that because we're the right people to be in control of that. We understand it all. And once you turn that over to them and they start doing the chopping, we're already losing the battle, right?
Because it almost sounds to me like we're talking about two different things. Understanding that they're related, but when you were on the previous slides, it was like,
do you want me to go back one?
Priorities as an individual, as a leader, come in that day and what you're going to do. And that, to me, seems a little, I understand that they're interrelated, but that seems different than now going to this. This sounds organizational.
It is.
Personal. So maybe I'm jumping ahead, but that's the difficulty is even if you have this, many times you're doing on a daily basis, those priorities, I think one of the things in our culture is they get defined by the expectations of those that are within our culture and our organizations.
No, you're right. You're right.
Judicial officers, whatever the case may be.
Right. We don't have control over all of those expectations, right? But I'm going to suggest to you that we have more control than we think. Very good observation. This really is the institutional level, right? And the other one before that was personal. How do we end up doing that? What I want to do is to say, let's think about what are the barriers and the things that are interrupting us every day on the personal level when I walk into work. The sacrifice, when we allow that to occur, when it gets off track, is this. It's the drivers for the institutional side that end up ultimately paying the price when we get ourselves distracted and we can't be paying attention to the things that we have to do. So they're integrally linked. That sounds like a tongue twister. They're all linked together. So we want to be able to think about this stuff, and at the end, what we really want to be able to do is to think about how we engage our entire court in the discussion of the process on how we set priorities, how we structure our work, and how we pay attention to the things that are important in terms of all of that stuff. So, see, now I'm going in the wrong direction. It's not the first time in my career I've gone in the wrong direction. I've gone forward, backwards. It works all the time. So here's the bottom line of it, and this is where people often can disagree with me. We actually have a lot more control over our priorities, over our timing, over the things that we do than we realize. Okay, we do get caught up in things that free us away, but we actually can exercise a lot of control over what we're paying attention to. There are two key ideas of that. One of them is disciplined thought. The other part is disciplined action. And the disciplined thought part is what we were talking about right in the beginning, our need to carve out thinking time. Because this is not easy. I've worked with a lot of organizations to sit down and really focus on their core services, really understand what it is they do. This can take months of discussion and work and back and forth where people start really honing in on what it is that they do. This is something you can't do over the weekend, you know, with your word processor or anything like that. It takes a lot of quiet time where you carve it out and you allow yourself to think. Now, if you think back to Dr. Hall's discussion this morning, the whole idea of stimulation and everything, we have so much noise in our lives that even the idea of quiet is almost becoming foreign to us, right? It's almost becoming foreign to us. Everywhere you go, you hear a lot of noise. My kids are constantly stunned at the idea that when they were in college, their schools were 5-6 hours away. I used to drive the entire time without even the radio on. Nothing, no stimulus, absolute quiet. To me, it was sheer heaven. To hit them, they would be suicidal. You know, they'd be going, "What do you mean you drive 6 hours without the radio on?" I go, "This is pure heaven to me. It's quiet. I don't get any quiet." But we have to be able to do that. Disciplined thought, Dr. Hall was talking this morning about when you get down into the deep part of thinking, right? You're showing down here on the line and you're really down deep into it. That takes time. It takes quiet. And it takes the discipline to actually do it, to go down there and do it. Disciplined thought. We have to structure everything we know, take all of our experience, turn that into a value for the court, and we do that through thinking. I had people make the comment, and this was in the morning session, that in some ways they're actually scared that they would be afraid to tell their boss that they were sitting there thinking because they don't do that, right? Now, it doesn't mean we're thoughtless, but it means that we're not carving out the kind of time we need to really get at the core things that we're supposed to be doing, which is fundamentally our job. And then disciplined action. Once we think about it, act on it, and act upon it decisively. Go out, get it, go do it, act on it, get it done. Not the normal pattern that we have, and really in any institution, not just courts or public sector. That's a big flaw everywhere in terms of how we do our work. What we pay attention to is actually a choice. That's why I really liked your comment about we jump in, right? They expect us to help and they expect us to fix it, and we do that right away. We don't always have to choose to go down that path, right? We can choose something different. So let's talk a little bit about reducing the distractions that are diverting our attention, okay? how many of you would agree that at least the planning and the strategic things are really fundamental to your role? That's part of your role, right? And then how many of you would agree that you don't get to do that very much? Yep. When I started this process, and I'm saying this really kind of with a whole sense of, in some ways, confessing to you that it took me a long time to get this process going. I had a very, very, very difficult time accepting myself within the leadership role that I had within these organizations, accepting that I had to do something very, very different, right? Part of it was because it was going to take some of the fun out of my job, or I thought it was going to take some of the fun out of my job, because I like being a helper. I like being the fix-it guy. How many of you people see yourselves as fundamentally fix-it people? Problem solvers. How many of you like it when your staff comes to you and says, I have a problem, can you help? You don't like it? Because that's an interruption in some levels. But there's a part of our personality, and part of the way we get into leadership roles is because of that personality trait. We like to problem solve. We like to help. And that's a very, very good thing. And what I had to say to myself was, it's very, very good, but I had to change where I was getting my reward system, right? Because I did love that. I did like it when people walked in and I got to be the guy who fixed it. And I jumped into that pool right away, you know, do it with no wings. I was just, go. But at the end of the day, I wasn't getting things done, and it wasn't in the best interest of my organization at all. So I started out with the concept of saying that out of my 40-hour work week, which we really know is a 60-hour work week, but let's just say with that traditional 40 that we like to talk about, at least 20 of those hours had to be devoted to my leadership role, paying attention to the organization and the institutional life. How many of you have 20 free hours? Anybody have 20 free hours? How many have 5? 2. Okay, about 6 people have 2 hours. We've got to change that a little bit. So let's talk about what some of those distractions are. Okay? I don't know if you recognize yourselves in this stuff, but this was kind of what my day was like when I worked in a general office. I work at home right now, by the way, so I can do anything I want. I don't get this stuff. But I wouldn't be in the door 5 minutes without the phone ringing, 3 texts with attachments. I'd look at my calendar, in an 8-hour day, I might have 15 meetings. The budget would be due, all this stuff is due, 6 people called in sick, the courtroom clerk is missing in action. You know, all of this stuff is going in when you walk in the door, right? Now, you probably walked in the door thinking you were going to do work on the budget or something like that. That's the thing that's there. And probably within the first 30 minutes, you're off on that trail somewhere else because somebody's interrupted because there's been some kind of crisis or there's something that you have to address. And some of them you pay attention to. Now, if you look at all of these, I will say that I do know that the one thing you would do on this, and I said this morning, the first thing you would do is call NACM, right? Actually, probably the real first thing you would do is if your chief judge is calling and they want to meet, and when they say they want to meet, by definition that means now. That's probably what you're going to do first, and that's okay. But if you look at it, these are the things that are happening constantly in the course of our day. The phone is ringing. Our email is popping up. We're getting people coming up and walking into the office and interrupting our work to tell us things. And it's not that they shouldn't be doing that. These are real things that are happening, right? And they engage us in that discussion. So we have all of this stuff, but how do we get that under control? I mean, what are we going to do? You heard Dr. Hall talk this morning, and he and I were actually talking last night because we were going down the same path on some of this stuff. But the myth of multitasking. What did you get out of his discussion this morning when he was talking about multitasking? Any comments on that? What did you think? Did you think he was right?
You don't really multitask very effectively. You said that you serial task at a very superficial level.
Right. How many of you agree with that? Right. But corporately, whether it's in the government or somewhere else, it doesn't matter that we might believe that, right? Everybody has to multitask. You walk into organizations, who do they look for their leadership team when they want to bring somebody in? They want a multitasker, right? When we're hiring anybody, we want somebody who can multitask. And every time I'm on a committee that's looking at that and they say we want a multitasker, I said, why don't we just bring in everybody in the world, and we'll just medicate them until they're in a stupor and they can't do anything but one thing at a time, okay? Because you can only do one thing at a time. And what really drives kind of the work product isn't what we're paying attention to, it's the time frame we have to get some critical things done, right? Some of the products that we produce would actually be incredible. We know exactly what it is in terms of quality, but time doesn't permit us to do that. If you're multitasking, by definition, you are losing traction all the time. Now, that doesn't mean you can't hear, people can't come in and tell you things, right? But you really can't multitask. You can do things one at a time. And you can either do 6 things at 30%, or you can do one thing at 100%. And depending upon what it is you're doing, some of those things better get to the 100% level because they're that important, okay? What I found in my career, well, not my career, I actually ultimately corrected this. But I found out that too many things were 30% for me, right? I kind of knocked a little bit of the work off of these bigger projects. I got partway down the path on that. I got part of this done. Or I did X, Y, and Z, and it might have been complete because they were urgent and I had to get them done. But nothing was really being done at the optimal level, and it wasn't really done at the level of quality that I thought I was perfectly capable of. And a big part of that was because I had too many things to do. Multitasking, absolutely 100% is a myth. You really need to stop and say, not only to yourself, but to your own staff, let's pay attention to things, okay? There are things we have to, that really weren't getting our 100% of our attention, and we try to do that. Anybody have the opposite point of view, that you really can multitask? Good. So why do we do it so much? Everybody agrees with it, but nobody challenges it at all. I can go to corporate groups like this all the time, and what I'm dealing with is listening to people talk about how they want multitaskers and how do we get those folks in my group. And I say, those people don't exist. You can't have those people in your group. Information and stimulus overload. So we have to transition from reactive to active. So we want to take control of our agenda, right? Not it always control us. I probably spent more time with the urgencies controlling me and deciding where I was going than the other way around, right? I was reactive, in reactive mode pretty much all the time. But we have to really reject the demands of our technologies and the things that we say are efficient that have imposed false expectations for 24/7 attention for work and instantaneous response. BlackBerries, email, Twitter accounts, iPods, iPads. They scream at us all the time, right? And we've allowed kind of the efficiency of technology to make us the most inefficient people on earth. Why am I saying that? All of these tools for efficiency have now made us the most inefficient people on earth. Why am I saying that? Or do you disagree? Maybe you think we are the most efficient people on earth.
Seems to favor the urgent.
It seems to favor the urgent and the important. I think that's a perfect answer to that. It does favor the urgent. It screams at us, deal with me now, the whole time. The other thing is, one of the beauties of this, and this is where these things can help, we can become more efficient because we have access to these things all the time, right? I'm not limited in my work to a 9-hour workday like I was when I started my career back when I was a really young man, and those years have been gone for at least 40. I had to be at work from 9 to 5. That's where everything was. Now I don't have to be at work from 9 to 5. In fact, as a consultant, I can choose to work anytime I want. And so, in fact, for me, that means I'm out of bed at 5 in the morning, I'm working at 6. It's great. You can do things in the evening if you want. We have a lot more control over when we do stuff, except for one thing. We didn't learn to put the barriers around it. So how many of you go home and your work day creeps home with you? How many of you check email in the evening, work email? How many of you take a laptop home? How many of you work on your computer for work at home on the weekends and in the evenings? How many of you get an email from somebody at work at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, bling, with an attachment? So it's good. They're efficiencies. We didn't put any boundaries on it, and so we've become much more inefficient. The other part around that is that the demand on our time means we're never, ever, ever, ever away from work, physically or mentally, because we bring the tools with us. They're in our house, right? These things are like roaches. They follow you everywhere. You can't quite get rid of them, right? So we got this whole thing, but we also have a society that says, answer me now. We don't have the impulse control anymore, culturally, to not respond to something. How many of you get an email or a text or something like that and you respond within 3 minutes? Yeah. And you got to do this, right? We got to do this right away. The little pling comes, and right away we're doing it. How many of you sit at your desk and your little email thing pops up to say, oh, I have a new email, and you click on it. You go read your email, right? You go home. These things talk to you. They're text, there's attachments, there's a whole bit. We're totally connected, you know? And being totally connected, tremendously positive things. Also, tremendously negative. Because, again, we haven't set the boundaries on them. And again, creeping into the workplace, just like everything else we were talking about, we're not setting boundaries within our own institutions around when people should and should not be working. There's now an expectation for instantaneous response. And you feel bad. How many of you don't respond to an email at night or something like that and you feel like you didn't do your job? Or you feel accountable because you didn't do it? Most people do. So how do we get some of the control over our own time again? How do we get it back? I mean, all of these things are great tools, and I love them, and the work world wouldn't even be here if we didn't have these kind of efficiencies today. They're wonderful. But we have to take control of them. We really do. I told this story that we're so stimulated with noise and stuff. This was probably about 10 years ago when my children were younger, and they were here, and we had a storm, and the power went out for 3 days. And I didn't notice because there are a lot of things I don't do. I don't watch a lot of TV. I didn't have a BlackBerry back then just because I had an attitude about them and all that stuff. Somewhere about an hour after the power went out, my kids were in distress because they were disconnected, right? They couldn't tweet. They couldn't text. They couldn't look out and see where their friends were. They couldn't get an email, the whole bit. They couldn't play music because nothing was there. And they literally didn't know what to do with quiet. They didn't know what to do. And I started to laugh, and I looked at my wife and I said, oh my God, we have 4 children. The power has been off for 45 minutes, and every one of them is in dire need of medication. You know, we got to just take them out. And it was, my God, Dad, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I said, why don't you just sit down and read a book? Or light a candle, or whatever. And that was so foreign to their thinking. And you could see their stress level rise as the time ticked by, and maybe somebody had tweeted them and they didn't know, right? There was a text or a tweet or some communication that they didn't have because their whole life is being linked in. The power came on at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and it woke me up because we had lights on in the house. The kids were still sleeping. I went down, I shut all the power off. And I thought, I want to see what they do tomorrow morning and if they can navigate themselves around something where there's no noise. And what they found, it took them a little while, but they were just frustrated. So they went out, they started playing games with one another. They pulled out Scrabble and games and all these things that they used to play with many, many years ago that they hadn't even touched in years. And by the time we got around to dinner, they were actually enjoying one another as human beings and probably knew each other at a whole new level than what they had before, in spite of the fact that they could text and talk to one another constantly if they wanted to do it. But it's the technology also replacing kind of the human component as well, right? So these things don't necessarily become helpful to us. We have to say to ourselves, what do we turn off in our own lives? Meetings. How many of you go to meetings? How many of you go to a lot of meetings? How many of you go to meetings that you really have to be at? Some. How many of you go to meetings that you just don't need to be there at all? Right? One of the very first things I did was I sat down and I looked at my calendar, because I didn't just have a lot of meetings. I had meetings that were booked for the exact same time, and I would have to look at the schedule and decide which of those meetings I was going to. Pretty soon it dawned on me that most of my day was going into meetings, and those meetings were not particularly productive. They didn't really advance the agenda at all, and I needed to get control of that. So I started setting my own parameters around that. And my question was, given my role, and I have up there, remember your role, the critical role that we fulfill in the courts. Does that meeting really require my presence, or is the court better off if I'm not there and I'm working on something else or doing something different than spending all of my time in a meeting? So I set down the parameters. What did I have to attend? What did I have to handle in other ways? The very first thing that required was that I had to trust my own subordinates, right? I had to trust that they would go to a meeting and be able to do that well. And I found out that not only did they do it extremely well, but they were very grateful for the opportunity, that I wasn't kind of, the paternal daddy sitting there making sure that everything was okay. They did incredible work without me being there. Some of them came to me and said, we're actually really, really good. The more you stay home, the better this court's going to run. You go, okay, that's great. But I didn't have to be there. Is your presence required? Do you even need all of those meetings? If the discussion won't lead to a management level decision, leave that meeting to others and get a summary report from somebody who's there. You don't have to go. First thing you can control is what meetings you're going to go into. You can also control institutionally how many meetings you have. Too often meetings are there with a sense of collaboration, so that they want everybody to be included in that. You might actually find out that you don't need to do that at all. There's a lot of ways to get people to feel included in their work without having to go sit into a meeting. Delegate where possible and learn to trust others to represent you well. Once I did that, once I started really putting into practice what I always told people, which is delegate well, trust people, pick the right people, my job became much easier because I actually started doing what I practiced, and I was right. I did have good people who could do all that stuff, and they didn't need me there at all. Cell phones and crackberries. Wonderful tools, but too often they distract our attention from what everything is that we're doing. They ping at us. It's unnecessary background noise. I think they're addictive devices, right? How many of you feel stress if your little thing's off? First thing, and I'm going to do this too, so I'm not being critical. First thing I'm going to do when this is over and get out that door, I'm going to turn on my BlackBerry. I'm going to see what emails came in or what text came in or the whole bit. And I probably won't get more than 4 feet out of the door before I have to turn it on to check that out. Okay, but they're addictive devices. They don't deserve more of our attention than our people do. If your stress level is up during this presentation because the device is off, we already know we have a control issue here, right? They don't get more attention than our people do. The other thing is that they replace our human interaction with people. We've stopped interacting with people very often, or at least at the right levels, because what can we do? We can text them, we can email them, we can ping them, we can do a million things, but we don't ever walk down the hall and sit down and talk with them the way we did that 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 5 years ago. We're allowing them to replace human interaction. And when we do that, we almost by definition lose control. I started timing it. I actually was able to eliminate hours of time in terms of email and all that kind of stuff by simply walking down the hall. The cycle of emails that would come in, because I got copied on everything, and then people would respond, and they'd expect a response. That one simple little thing that 10 years ago I would walk down the hall and say, can you do this? And somebody would say yes, and they would go get it done, is now 15 emails. while people pass it around and talk about it and set the priorities. It takes up an enormous amount of time for something you can do just by asking a question. No one dies if you miss an email, a text, an attachment, or a message. Don't allow it to substitute for human interaction. These things scream at us. I mean, they really do if you think about it. Put them in their place. Every one of these things has a silencer. And they have turn-off buttons, they have alert controls. Use them. That's part of the beauty of the technology. You can have access to it or not. The thing is, we never do the not part and turn it off. Email. How many of you get inundated with email? And you just have more email than you can possibly deal with. Never really makes sense. The number of emails would be absurd to me. And I came up with a strategy basically to get control of the email. And the real reason for it wasn't that I wanted to be a better manager or I wanted to be more efficient. It had to do with the fact that one day something very, very, very serious came to me from a staff member who was there, sent it to me as an email, but I had 92 emails. So by the time I got to that email, I was home. It was 7 o'clock at night, and I was sitting in my computer at home and read this email. This was something that needed my attention almost immediately. And I thought to myself, how do I avoid this? I mean, we can't really do, if you have 92 emails, you can't be spending all of your time sitting there trying to prioritize them. So the goal initially was to say, let me know when there's something so important for me to pay attention to that I pay attention to it. So we changed everything. We put everything in the subject line. Ask your own staff. Direct your attention to it by labeling them as urgent, action required, decision, or advisory. Those are the first things in the subject matter line. And then after that, they can put whatever they wanted. But it was a way for me to get priority, right? Also was a way for me to get control of my mail, because I could sit there and go through everything. The first two, they're urgent or action required. They got my attention, and I paid attention to them, and I could do that. Okay? Everything else, I still read them and still did them, but they fell down the list in terms of how I was paying attention to them. So in some ways, just in the subject line, they were filtering my email for me, which was really important. Then gradually we got to the point where we were actually able to say, just don't even send me emails. I don't need to be CC'd on everything in the world. I realize people do that to be visible to management. But I decided to substitute time going out and walking around with them so that they were visible to me in other ways. And I didn't have to have 350 emails that absolutely were irrelevant to me, simply so people had the comfort level that they were visible to me, right? And so again, email was replacing human contact for visibility. I got out of my desk, walked around, talked to people all the time, and the urgency to include me on emails almost was eliminated overnight, just through that one simple action. But this is actually very, very helpful in terms of distractions. Turn off email notifications and set aside time to review bulk emails. The constant interruptions from email kills our ability to focus and concentrate and to get into that deep level of concentration where you can stay there for a while that Dr. Hall was talking about this morning. I turned them off. I set 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the afternoon for me to go back, look at all my emails, and I respond then instead of the constant start, stop, start, stop, start, stop of the interruption of an email coming in, okay? That in and of itself was able to gain me about 3 to 4 hours a week in terms of my time. Because I wasn't even aware how much time I was spending on email until I decided to stop paying attention to it and turn it off. But that interruption, the ping, you know how it shows up right down in the corner of your little thing? New email. It comes up. Don't ever click on it. Turn off that entirely so that you're not even notified. Then go back and start, and you can respond to a lot of emails in bulk in a relatively short period of time. But the interruption times in terms of thinking to restart everything that you start when you get those interruptions for there, it's tremendously inefficient. It's a great, you just lose so much time because you're always restarting some effort, okay? Open door policies. How many of you have those? Okay, do you like them? Mixed bag? I see you smiling. Why?
I think it can be both ways. It can get that interruption, but it also allows you to have interaction with them.
It is. It is a mixed bag.
Halfway open.
Halfway works. That's really something that I think people really do have to evaluate in terms of their own management style and the culture of their court and the whole bit. I wouldn't say don't do it. I will say this. I had an open door policy for many, many years of my career and also found it was much like the emails. It's a start-stop thing. the interruptions can really be disruptive to whatever it is you're trying to do. And so I was always afraid that I was going to sacrifice exactly what you were saying. The interaction was important to me. I wanted them to know I was accessible to them. I was afraid I was going to lose that if I didn't do it. But, you know, the little cartoon over there is kind of really what all of our offices are like. I mean, people just kind of line up out the door and pull a number, you know, now serving number 32. And we'll see how that is. But it really does take your attention away from the task at hand, because they're always unscheduled, right? These are interruptions where they're just walking up into your door. So I had to say to myself, what's not getting done in a timely way because of this? And can I still have everything that I want around the human interaction part in some other format, some other way, without letting them constantly interrupt me? And so what I did was I experimented with setting a time slot where I was available. And it was, you know, basically an open door policy. And because I had a big broad hours as to when it was okay to come into my office. But once I set that, the key to that is if you say you're going to be in your office, be in your office. So that if they come and you're not there, they don't have to look around for you. Or now it invites them to come back at some time that's really not within that schedule. What I found was that actually worked pretty well for me, because it was still quasi-open, but I had bulk time. I had chunks of time where I communicated to the staff I needed to be able to work at my desk on things that were important to them. And that kind of cut down on that thing entirely. Didn't eliminate it, but to be honest, I didn't want it completely eliminated. I just wanted some real time. So one of the things we have to do is really spend some time making our own list that identify areas of distraction, those things that take our time and it's out of proportion to their importance, right? That's a critical part of what we're talking about here. What's important, what's not important, or maybe we should say what's less important rather than not, because everything we do has some level of importance, but it's not always equal. And what I think I found, kind of in terms of looking at when I had to change all of this stuff, was that I didn't have any levelers. Everything was, in some ways, of equal importance, right? Because everything got almost my full attention in the time frame in which people wanted me to pay attention to it. So I wasn't doing any discrimination around important and not important. It was much more of reacting and responding and going out, and all of that control that needed to be in place in my agenda really wasn't there at all. And so I wasn't getting a whole lot of things done. So we have to think about what those things are, what the distractions are, and really kind of recognize that everything, I had to build a hierarchy from critically important to unimportant in terms of the things that were being brought to my desk. And then the commitment I had to make was everything that was critically important, I simply could not fail to do. I couldn't fail to do those. Because if I failed, I was failing the organization and I was failing the mission of the organization. And for a public servant, that means you are absolutely failing the public. And I took that very seriously, that I was failing the public because of my inability to get control of my time. Any comments on this stuff? Other things that you think are distractions, recommendations for other people that you might have tried? Go ahead.
How about friendly visits from your colleagues?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Everybody's smiling. That struck a chord. So what do you do about the friendly visits?
Well, it's better for you to get up out of your chair and go visit them, because then you have control over how long it's going to last.
Yeah, that's right.
If they're in your office, you're have to stay.
No, but that's right. And I think, and I would say that that's actually one of the more difficult things to have to deal with, because it's so interpersonal, where you really don't want to offend people and you want them to feel welcome. There are all the good things around what that means, right, in terms of just the human interaction and wanting to do it. But it takes incredible amounts of time. I was talking to a group, this is probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and one woman's answer was, she says, "Oh, I solved that problem really easily." And I said, "How?" And she said, "I never look at them and I just keep typing the whole time in the office." And I went, well, that's a whole new issue, you know, because we want human courtesy that's there. You've still got to be able to do that, and it takes time to practice to say something like, "I'm really very busy. Can we continue this later?" Or can I come see you in a few minutes when I get this done? And then do exactly what you're saying. Get on their turf so that you can always feel free to leave. But that's another huge distractor. I think one of the hard things is the workplace is also a social place, right? And we like that as well. And it's always trying to figure out what the balance is in terms of what are we giving up and what are the trade-offs around some of these things that we want to do when we're really trying to carve out time. What I think the most important part of it is that we can't fail to carve out the time. I am not kidding when I started out talking about the whole idea of really getting to the core understanding of what it is that courts do in society and why it is so important. I absolutely 100% believe that. And anytime we're doing something where we're not able to talk about, where we haven't carved out the time to say, these are the priorities of the court, these are the core services, these are the things we absolutely must do, this is where we're going to focus our attention strategically in the court. Anytime we're not able to do that, we're jeopardizing part of that mission, and that's a tremendous loss to the community. You had a comment?
I was just going to say, going back to the technology piece and that kind of thing, I think that even takes it a step further where we don't even carve out time to be together because we can do it by conference call or those kind of things. So we don't even have forums where people can gather and spend 5 minutes at the beginning of a meeting saying, how's your kids or whatever, you know. And so there's a real thirst for that because we just don't have, we carved out any time to do that. And technology, as you say, is efficiency. It saves us money where we don't have to travel and all that. But it really does take away then from any kind of time to get to know each other and have that social interaction.
No, I think that's a great point. You know, the adage is if you're high tech, you have to also be high touch. You have to do the two in conjunction because technology removes us so much from the human element. And I think that's actually very, very valid. And we have to go back and always say to ourselves, what are we replacing here in terms of the technology, in terms of the real advantage of what happens when people interact well with people, right? We are able to solve problems. We solve them best in a face-to-face forum with people if they're real problems, not through the technology side of this at all. Any other comments on that or ideas? Okay. So a couple of things around turning down the noise. Practice strategies to do that. Experiment. Keep things that work. Discard, but keep experimenting. Find out what works well in terms of your court, the culture of your court, and your personality and your management style. There is no such thing as one size fits all here. We have to play around with them. I found that the more I experimented with it, and I actually kind of made it a game with my staff. I would do this stuff. Are you familiar with the cartoon Dilbert? You know, Dilbert and it's all the management stuff. I used to have a Dilbert contest that was all around this stuff. And so the staff, I would cut out the Dilbert from the Sunday thing, white out all the real words of Dilbert, and then distribute it to the staff, and they were allowed to make up their own version of Dilbert. There was only one rule. They weren't allowed to be mean or passive-aggressive. They were allowed to be direct and honest, but they couldn't be mean. And honest to God, part of it was everything around the management function and how we interacted with one another and what we needed to do to make things work. They had to turn those things in on Wednesday. I'd give it out on Monday. I would, for literally an hour and a half, I would be in my room on the floor practically crying. I mean, some of these people, these things were hysterical that they were bringing back here. But out of the hysterical part, really opened up a door for us to have a lot of discussions through laughter around the comments they were making around our management practice and our style, and then say, okay, what do we need to do kind of as a team to kind of make this all work better in the whole bit? It's a great way in order to do that, and that worked well with my style. But keep trying something. Recognize that we're human, okay? We're allowed to be human beings and get tired and exhausted and want work to stop. We're allowed to do that. And we're allowed to have our staff expect us to be human around that. We only have so much effort. We only have so much time to pay attention to things. That's the human reality of it. The more we do that, the better off our court's going to be. Have open discussions with your own team on how your work model might change and why it's critical for team success. I was only able to make these changes through a lot of discussion with my own staff. I laid out the case for why I needed to do that and why I thought it was important, and they bought off on it. And the interesting thing was they all agreed because they said, one of the harder things is that when we have to get things that are decisions and they're critical decisions and they're not being made, we're adrift. And we know that it's not your fault, But the reality of it is I didn't have time to do all the research around the things that I needed to make important decisions on. And their point was that a lack of decisiveness actually was more harmful to them than everything they were gaining by my white knight personality of jumping in to help. They far preferred that my time was being spent looking at everything, making decisions, giving direction, and understanding what it was we were doing. That's where they actually wanted me to be. They just never had the opportunity to see that because I hadn't done that in that particular style. Communicate to your own staff that it's okay for them to adopt new practices too, right? So as you discuss it with them, let them think of some of these ideas as well. They're in the same boat we're in. Fire drills, lots of interruptions. They have the same overload and stimulation that we have. We have to respect that. And then as they do that, we can talk about as a team how you do it. And recognize that very often people who will report to us, they need our permission to change their management style. In the morning session, one of the guys made the comment, you know, a lot of these things are good ideas, but I don't have a boss who will respect that. How do I deal with that? And so we explored that a little bit. And the big idea was, well, have you ever really had that discussion with your boss? I mean, it could be your perception rather than the reality of it. And have you had it in this context with this tone around how you want that kind of help? Maybe they don't understand that you're seeing when they do things like send you an email at 7 o'clock at night, that might be because in their time frame, it's a moment to do it. They might not know that you're interpreting that as an order to do this by tomorrow morning, and that might not be their intent at all. So again, the discussion, right, the human part of talking about it rather than the technology. And you might find out that your perceptions are wrong. Commit to focusing attention on what's important. We talked about the urgent always displacing the important. The urgent's always going to be there. You know, you're never going to turn that off. The crisis of the day is going to be the crisis of the day every single day. Going to be there. The thing is, we can't change the crisis, but we can change our response to the crisis in terms of who does it, how it gets done, how we pay attention to it, and what it does in terms of our own productivity and our own work, and then ultimately our own relationships with our own staff. So understand that. There's no way as managers that we're going to ever solve the crisis issue, because there's always time for a new one. Okay? Any comments, questions, feedback, thoughts, things you've done that might help people in the room?
I'll ask you a question. What is a way to balance the difference between allowing a area of people who work, for example, by on their desktop, say a clerk's office, and getting the work done and allowing them to be friendly and have good morale and allow them to chat versus just getting the work done?
Mm-hmm. Do you guys have any responses or back on that? So you wanted strategies to let them do both?
Kind of.
Okay. Do you mind if I ask, have you tried anything or you haven't figured out yet?
You know, actually, it's not my problem, it's my clerk's problem.
Right.
So hopefully that she's going to take care of that.
Here, I mean, you guys, do you want to make comments on that, or do you want to have me kind of dive in on that one?
I'll say one thing. I think
Okay.
that an open discussion on what's expected, and then being direct when you observe it, and going and approaching the individuals doing it. You know, initially a shotgun approach, this is what's expected of the office, but then break it down and be direct with the people that are actually doing it, so everyone's not taking the hit on it, just because it might just be two clerks that continuously do it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really good. And what I like about that answer is it is a direct discussion. You sit down and do that. Sometimes these are multiple discussions where you sit down and start getting people to think differently about the culture of work and what the boundaries are around that. But don't be afraid to define the boundaries for them, right? I mean, that's also part of what we do. It's not just simply the question of, gee, they like to do it, and I'm not sure how to stop it. The answer to that is when you sit down and you have a discussion on the boundaries where you want, and it's okay to say we want the balance of both, right? There's the productivity, real work side. There's the human interaction side, and the human interaction side actually brings a lot of value in terms of the culture of the court. But it can't be all one side where nothing's getting done. So you have that discussion, and you be very direct, kind of what the expectations are around the productivity side, and the social side so that they understand it. And you might have to do that over and over and over again until they understand it. It's not going to be a one-time discussion. But again, this is where broad-based discussions and just being really open with your own staff goes a long way in terms of problem solving. Don't let those things kind of hide under the covers and not address them. When people do surveys around managers and leadership, one of the biggest issues that they say is it's not even necessarily the management style of someone. For staff, the answer is issues don't get discussed and they don't get decided. Okay, there's no decision made. They're left in limbo, so there is no guidance. And kind of the preponderance of that is that what people would actually prefer is a bad decision that isn't great is better than inactivity or inaction, because they think nothing's happening at all and they can't influence that. Okay. People are actually pretty good when they think they have a way to influence an outcome or talk about it. They're pretty good about engaging in it and then even changing their behavior once everybody understands what that is. But again, it's talking about it, and it's talking about it openly and directly and getting it dealt with. Other questions? Comments? Okay, well, thank you all very much for your attentiveness. I really enjoyed this. I will say this, whenever I tell people that I work with courts and judges, their eyes kind of go big because they go, why would you ever want to work with judges? I mean, they have to be really hard to work with. And I always go, no, here's what I like about court people and judges. They're always very open, Judges, they're direct. Do you ever wonder what a judge is thinking? Not really. I mean, they tell you. So you're never in that swimming underworld of things being unclear. They let you know, and that always works for me. So, but anyway, thank you so much for your time and your attention. I appreciate it very much. And I thank NACM for letting me come here and talk with you all and work with you while you're here. So, thank you.
Please fill out your